Learning and development programs must deliver measurable results that align with operational goals in order to be valued.
They just cut my budget, so they don't think we're important. I said, no, you're looking at it all wrong. I said, you need to look at yourself in the mirror because you're not watching the gauges. You're not watching the performance metrics. You're not adding any value to the organization. And it's not personal. When they cut your budget, it means that you're not adding value. So they're taking that money and putting it elsewhere that's adding value to the organization because they have scarce resources. So it's not personal to you that they're cutting your budget. It's that you didn't hold yourself accountable to what they need.
That's Ajay Pangarkar, author of Learning Metrics, How to Measure the Impact of Organizational Learning. Ajay will share how to understand L&D's role in an organization to make sure you're helping the learners, your department, and the business succeed. Next on Powered by Learning.
Powered by Learning is brought to you by DaVinci Interactive. DaVinci's approach to learning is grounded in 30 years of innovation and expertise. We use proven strategies and leading technology to develop solutions that empower learners to improve quality and boost performance. Learn more at davinci.com.
Joining me today is DaVinci President Mason Scuderi and Ajay Pangarkar, a partner and co-founder of CentralKnowledge.com, a leading workforce performance consultancy. Ajay recently co-authored a book with Teresa Kirkwood called Learning Metrics, How to Measure the Impact of Organizational Learning. He joins us today to talk about the book and the importance of measuring data to improve employee and business performance. Ajay, welcome back to Powered by Learning.
I'm very happy to be here, Susan, with you and Mason. So it's great to be back. Really enjoyed chatting with you both.
Welcome to the podcast, Ajay.
Ajay, good to see you. Tell us a little bit about your background and your company so our listeners understand the perspective you're coming from.
You did say you have a limited time in a podcast, right? So, okay. I'll keep it short. My background actually is interesting because I came from, I won't get into it too much, but I came from an engineering background first. Didn't like it. Pursued a business degree, both in finance and accounting. Went on to do a CPA in Canada, became a fellow at a CPA some years ago. But I also went to pursue a graduate degree in adult education. And at that time, I was trying to figure out how to put the two pieces together. How do I put this finance accounting with education and learning? And it came to me that during my experiences at when I was working for a major multinational, leading a department, they were sending people over to training, and I always felt that the people coming back weren't being held accountable, or I should say, training was being held accountable appropriately to my business success within the department. And so that epiphany sort of revealed to me that there's a disconnect between how training and learning takes place in an organization and its accountability to the success of the organization. And so from that, I decided to, with my partner and my wife, I should say, she's also my co-author, to start a business and lead that charge, try to make learning more strategic and accountable within organizations.
And you've definitely done that. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you.
Ajay, can you kick us off with a summary of Learning Metrics and its intended audience?
Well, in summary, the title really expresses it all, right? So it is about holding learning accountable to specific objectives and outcomes. The term metrics is actually about that. Where it becomes a bit of a misnomer is like, do we create our own learning metrics? And that's what the book is about, but it's also what the book isn't about. What I mean by that is the book is speaking to how do we make learning accountable to metrics within the organization, not creating our own metrics. And while creating our own metrics within learning is useful and required within the scope of learning itself when we're designing it, the real purpose of learning is actually to make a difference in the organization. So the scope of the book takes you from a very high-level strategic purview of the organization and moving down through the funnel where you get into a very frontline, granular, actually hands-on, roll-up-your-sleeve kind of how do you apply learning within an organization to make it accountable. And if I'm designing a learning course or a program, how do I actually make that happen within an organization that people say, wow, that was well worth it, and it's moving the organization forward. In essence, and within, 30 seconds, that's the book. But it really takes people through that journey where basically you have to see, you have to take that 50,000-foot view and then bring yourself down into a very detailed level. The audience itself is actually, people say, well, you're really speaking to people who are accountable for learning, meaning the CLO or train directors or that kind of stuff. And while that's true, they're probably going to get a lot of use out of the book. What I really want to speak to is the people who are actually getting hands-on with the learning. So the instructors, the instructional designers. And those are the people that I think who always say to themselves that we don't have to worry about that stuff. And I say, no, you do have to worry about that stuff because you're expected to know the outcomes of what learning is supposed to deliver. So how do you design something when you don't know the overall picture? And so that's really where I'm trying to come out with the book is speaking to the decision makers of learning, but I want to bring it down to those who are actually in the foxhole of learning, basically, who are actually fighting the fight and trying to make it accountable.
That makes such sense when you think about it, because learning certainly has gained prominence over the years among leadership and having a seat at the table, but it doesn't all the time get that stakeholder acceptance, and that might be because L&D professionals are using their own data and not looking at the data of the organization that they're serving.
Well, Stephen Covey always said, begin with the end in mind, right? So, if you don't know where your destination is, how do you plan for it, right? If the three of us wanted to take a trip somewhere, I'm not going to say, let's just get into a car or hop on a plane and go somewhere.
I'm not that spontaneous. I need to plan it.
No, me neither. But even if you are spontaneous, you're still going to have a destination in mind, right? But if I told you, just grab a plane, let's grab a car, let's go, you're going to sort of question me a little bit and say, well, what are we doing this? Why am I wasting my money? Why am I wasting my resources doing this with you, Ajay? Without that destination, and knowing where that destination is and that accountability, you cannot put something together. And you said something, Susan, that was really interesting, that seat at the table that we speak about, that proverbial seat at the table where we're part of the decision-making process. Leaders need that. I mean, I'm talking about not learning leaders. I'm talking about the C-suite of the organization. They want us there because they know. And I know people are going to have a hard time believing this, Mason, when I say it, but learning is in the top 5 priorities of C-suite decision makers. Learning and knowledge within an organization is a priority, but there's a disconnect from the learning side. And I hate to be that bad tasting cough medicine where I'm feeding it to people, but the reality is we're not connecting to what they actually need. And we need to make that connection within their organization and connect to those performance metrics.
Ajay, what do you think historically, why has there been a disconnect between operational and learning metrics?
Well, this is all anecdotal and it's probably just my opinion, by the way. But, working within a corporation for many years and in different sizes of companies, I was also in a small company. Whenever training would come up, it was almost that spoiled child syndrome. What I mean by that is prior to technologies and that came out in learning in the last, 10, 20, 25 years, it was always, we have to put money to training and we'll just dump money there and they'll do what they do. And hopefully people will get something out of it. And that's sort of like that. Well, I call it the spoiled child syndrome because we just got money, the truck backed up, money dumped in, and we were supposed to skill up people. Really what training was about was actually skilling up people for, onboarding, getting people skilled up to be able to do a job. And of course, compliance. Those are the 2 basic things. But over time, we need more than that. And so when technology came out and more accountability was required because of constant change within an organization, and change for me implies constant learning, that change requires people to accumulate and assimilate knowledge at a rapid pace. But the point being is that there's still that disconnect in accountability because I think there's still a mindset that, well, they just do this learning stuff and we don't understand how it applies to people. And there's a disconnect between the decision makers not understanding how to connect it. I mean, I'm talking about the C-suite outside of learning, and the learning people not really being literate enough to make that connection. And I think there's that chasm, if you want to call it.
Ajay, it's great to hear about your career experience. What do you think, drill down into the most impactful career experience that informed your message in learning metrics?
Well, I sort of alluded to in the previous question when I was working at this major multinational. We were actually acquired. I was working for a small company. We were acquired into it. And like any young person, I was quickly rising up the ranks and I was managing a department. And every single time my boss would say to me, the department or the division supervisor would say to me, send the staff to training. Okay, the first time's kind of nice. Money was coming out of my budget. I was held to very certain standards to achieve performance objectives for the department with my staff. Second time comes around, send the people to training. Okay, money comes out, people leave, come back. And none of this was being applied. And this kept repeating a few times until one time my boss said to me, send the staff to training. And I'm like, I don't think so. And he looks at me, he goes, why? It wasn't really a question. You're supposed to do it. And I'm like, no, until you tell me what my money being taken out of my budget is doing for the department and how am I achieving my objectives better when they come back. When you tell me that, then I'll be willing to spend the money. And so he looks at me and he goes, yeah, but we need to basically get economies of scale out of it. We spend so much on training and we have to put so many butts in seats. And so bring down the cost per person. And I said, well, that's not a reasonable metric to justify spending on a business activity like training. The metric I said to him, and I was young and brash. And I said to him, I said, the metric you want to measure is what are these people doing better when they come back than when they left? And he looks at me and goes, well, you're probably right, but still send them to training. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm not winning this. I mean, I'm winning the battle, but I'm not winning the war. And it just bothered me significantly. So at one point I just said to him, I said, you can't hold me to the same standards of performance outcomes if I'm not getting the value out of what these people are supposed to be learning and applying within the job. And that's really the biggest lesson that's lasted with me for 25, 30 years now.
Yeah.
That has stuck with me. And I tell that to people, especially when C-suite executives, a lot of training people don't call me. I think I mentioned this to you, Mason, previously, but training people don't call me. It's actually senior managers within organizations who say to me, training is not doing what it's supposed to do. Can you go talk to them? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, so that's sort of, it's still existing today, which is quite surprising.
The word discipline is what pops into my mind, when we think about using learning metrics to really justify training. And we might be a little bit afraid of that, right? Because we always want to see more training and new exciting technologies. But really what you're doing is creating something that's sustainable by using learning metrics to connect to organizational leaders.
Yeah. And of course, we have all this technology, as you mentioned, right? You guys have some great technology as well. But at the end of the day, a technology is just a tool. A tool is only as useful for its purpose as you apply it and use it within the context of how you're making it accountable, right? So the tool is just a tool. You can't blame an LMS or any learning tool for not working when you don't have your objectives set up straight properly. At the end of the day, it's really about, again, I use the word accountability. And to your point, a bit of discipline of making sure we're meeting the right objectives to put the right tools in place, right? So that's where I'm sort of coming from.
So Ajay, within our organizations, if we're looking to build accountability and looking to increase the emphasis on learning metrics, what are some tactics that we can use to increase buy-in?
Well, as you know, I do quite a few courses with LinkedIn Learning. One of them is called Gaining Buy-in for your learning efforts. And, I think one error that a lot of people make in learning, and this is just natural human instinct, it's nothing more than that. We tend to go to people who we believe are going to make the decision, right? So who do we go to? We go to the senior leaders of the organization, right? The people who we think are controlling the purse strings and making the final decisions on everything. So we go to the CFO and, senior vice presidents and whatever of the organization and get their sign off, even maybe the CEO if this organization is small enough, and get their right off. And we say, okay, we got their approval. Everybody should be able to accept it. Well, that's false. That's a myth. To me, there are always, generically, by the way, it's probably more levels, but generically, there's 3 levels of buy-in for learning. One, of course, is the senior leadership that I talked about. You need to get their buy-in, of course, and support. But they're just endorsers. They're not the actual people who are going to be bought into it. You need the mid-level managers or the operational managers who are actually burdened with making these metrics happen. They're under that kind of pressure. But more importantly, if you want to see your learning fail, ignore the users or the employees who are actually taking the learning. Because those people are the ones who are going to make you successful or sink you. If they don't feel that learning is valuable to their organization, or to themselves, I should say, because it's human nature to look out for ourselves to, do better in our jobs, get a promotion, get more pay, whatever it is, those incentives. If that training is not doing something for them to make them better in whatever their intrinsic motivation is, they're going to just trash you, and it's going to go up that food chain. And then that so senior leadership is going to say, well, why did we actually approve this? And, if your learning is useless, why did we do this? So in essence, there are 3 levels of buy-in that you need to get, and you have to approach them differently. Not lie to them. I didn't say lie here. I just said differently. Each of them have a perspective on how they see training affecting the organization. The senior leadership is very strategic, and the middle level manager is very operational, translating that strategy into operations. And basically the people actually doing the work are the ones actually applying it. And so I always say to them before, or the one thing I always like to say is that when you go to the employees, rather than push it onto them, ask them what they want to learn. Like, what is their need? And get them to buy into it that way. That way they are invested into helping you design the learning they want, not what you want to push onto them.
Yeah, that really speaks to the value of buy-in across the whole organization.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the place to start, where you can find the synergy and the alignment from all the way at the top.
It's funny, I work backwards, Mason. I'd work actually, before I would go to the senior leadership, I'd say, why don't you go to the department?
Mm-hmm.
Go to the operational manager and say, can I speak with you and find out what your performance pain points are? Like, what are the issues you're encountering? What do you have to meet in the next 6 months, 12 months as part of your objectives? Okay, great. Now that I know that, how do your people fit in? Can I talk to them and find out what they need, right? If you want to do a true needs assessment at an organization, you need to talk to those people because they know their jobs. They know their accountability. And then once you get that, now you can feed it up the food chain and say, okay, how does this apply strategically to the organization? How does this connect up here to the senior leadership's decision making? And
then you're creating training that's impacting employees and impacting the organization, and not just doing training for training's sake.
Exactly. I'm not any smarter than anybody else in the world. I mean, and this is to me what I call unknown common sense for training and development people. This is just things that when I say it, they say, oh yeah, that's right. You already know this. I'm just revealing something you already know, but you're not acting on. And I think that's really very important.
Well, as we're working towards more visible metrics within an organization and metrics that align, to the top line company mission and goals, what would you say is an actionable piece of advice for L&D professionals that they can take away from the book?
So there's a couple of things, actually. A lot of learning and development people, well, I would say especially people at the lower levels of training and development, meaning who are actually involved in designing training and actually trying to decide what has to happen in training, often feel a little lost. And the one piece of advice I would give to them is that if you're feeling lost and not sure where you should focus your efforts without looking, because it's embarrassing sometimes to go up to the decision maker and say, what training should I be doing? Right? You're hard to decide that. So I say, well, figure out what is the focus of your organization first. If you are lost, what is your organization's intent? And that's very simple. There's a mission statement. All successful organizations have mission statements. And in that mission statement, and people say, well, that's very high level, very strategic. Yeah, I get it. But within that mission statement, if you look at the elements, if it's done well, you can back that into the operations, because each of those elements in the mission statement speak to some operational element within the organization. And once you break it down into the operational elements, you know where they're focusing their efforts and where the emphasis is of their intent of the organization. And once you figure that out, what their focus is, well, now you can then go back to what I just said before. Go to those operational areas that are under that kind of pressure and say, okay, you have objectives to meet. Let's talk about that, right? Either way, whether you don't know and that's where you need to find your focus, or you do know and you go see these people. In school, if your teacher told you had a test tomorrow, most of us would freak out, because we'd say, oh my God, there's a test tomorrow. What do I need to know? How do I pass this test? But if a teacher said, well, I'm going to give you all the answers, you'd be a little more relieved, right? You say, okay, now I have all the answers. You just didn't ask. You don't know what questions you're going to ask, but you have all the answers. And this is what happens in organizations. Every organization that is functioning well have some form of performance framework. And this performance framework is throughout the organization. It stems from the mission, as I mentioned before. It breaks it down operationally. And within that performance framework, the lower you go, and I say lower, I don't mean that derogatory. As you get more granular within the organization, the more precise those metrics become. So if I go to an internal operations, like I'll use a simple example, let's say manufacturing. And they have, and at their performance framework and their scorecard says they have to produce so many widgets per hour, per day, per week, per month. And they have metrics on quality standards and speed and whatever, reliability. I know those metrics are key to making that manufacturing department successful. So now I have the answers. Now I have to go discuss with the operations and say, okay, what's going on here? You have a defect quality rate of, maximum of 8%, but you're right now at 10. So I know there's an issue here. How can I help you and help the employees improve? Now, there's two answers that are going to come back to. It's either going to be a process issue or a people issue. The two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but those are the two issues that usually come up. Process issues are not your domain. They have to fix the process. But when they fix the process, it usually affects the people. So when people are affected, that's where we step in, right? We have to now help them understand the new process. And so now, as soon as we know that metric of bringing it from 10 to 8, that's their goal for the next 6 months or year. Even if we move that needle down to 9, we're still going to look like heroes, right? Because that is a key metric that we are able to influence. And I said the word influence because we cannot forget that learning is just one component of many other elements in the organization affecting that operational activity, right? So we'll do our best, and we have to understand the interconnections of how we're impacting it and affecting other areas. But we're one element that can help change that, but we need to work with the other elements to make sure that we have a holistic approach to it and make sure they can move that needle from 10 to 9 to 8, even to 7. And I'm making a very simple example, but this actually happened to me working with a client. We actually moved the needle there. I can't remember the numbers, but similar to what I just shared. It was like 10, and then we brought it down to 5. And it's like the productivity improvement, the savings, the intangibles like customer satisfaction, the reduction in returns and complaints and all this kind of stuff, that amounts to a lot. And that learning department became an integral component to that manufacturing department becoming better. So the answers are there. You just need to ask the questions and ask the right questions and understand what those answers are. I hope that makes sense.
It does. I loved in the recent article that you authored where you gave the analogy about driving a car without a dashboard. And I thought that's really a good analogy about, if you're not listening to the metrics and listening to the learners, that this is how your training could evolve. Talk a little bit about that and how people can formalize this process so it can be more of a proactive, strategic process instead of a reactionary one.
Yeah, that article was just to mention, it was in trainingindustry.com, and it's free for people to access, so if they want to read it. But it actually goes back to my days when I first learned to drive, and my father bought me my first car, and I would ignore all the gauges on there, and the check engine light would come up, and he would say to me, there's a check engine light coming up. You got to do something about it. Well, until something happens, I'm going to ignore it, right? That kind of thing. But in reality, I don't know if we all drive, right? So if we drive our car, we're watching the speedometer, so we're not breaking the law, right? We're watching the gas, so we have sufficient fuel in the car to get where we want to go. I have a classic car, and I watch the temperature gauge constantly because that thing goes too high. I got to stop and figure out how to cool this car down. So I'm watching a bunch of things to make sure that I'm achieving the goal I want to achieve to get to my destination. And I think one more thing, and I don't want to come down too hard on training and development because I do admire training and development. I think it's a fantastic function within an organization and even more important than ever before. But one thing for training and development people, unfortunately, they also don't check the gauges within the organization, but they also drive blindfold. So they're driving a car, not checking the gauges, and driving blindfold. And those two things combined is why training gets such a bad rap among decision makers. And I always say that it goes back, I might be jumping around here, but that analogy of the car sort of equates to when people say, well, Ajay, my budget, they just cut my budget, so they don't think we're important. I said, no, you're looking at it all wrong. I said, you need to look at yourself in the mirror because you're not watching the gauges. You're not watching the performance metrics. You're not adding any value to the organization. And it's not personal. When they cut your budget, it means that you're not adding value. So they're taking that money and putting it elsewhere that's adding value to the organization because they have scarce resources. So it's not personal to you that they're cutting your budget. It's that you didn't hold yourself accountable to what they need. And they look at me and they say, well, they get really negative and resistant about it. And I say, look, I work with an organization that invests more money in downtimes. I worked with one major electronic company that we all have their products probably in our desk. I won't mention names. But that company, when they saw the down cycle, more money was going into the learning and development space because they wanted to skill up their people for the uptick when the economy turned or when the cycle changed or whatever it may be, that their people were ready to go. But that wasn't by accident. It was just, they just didn't have money. They had learning fully integrated. Learning was fully integrated into the culture. So they weren't an afterthought. They weren't like, we need training now. Training was always in the discussions and always looking at being part of the conceptualization of the strategy and the operations. And I think if that answers your question, Susan, that might be a long way around it, but you want to look at the gauges and you want to remove the blindfold and you want to be part of the conversation. And that's really where you can add value.
Yeah, it's a really compelling message and I think a timely message as well.
Well, Mason, today, like I said, basically there's three things that leaders look at all levels, depending on and what level of granularity. Keep things simple. They look at how to manage risk, how to manage change, and how to manage performance. Again, these three things are not mutually exclusive. And everything that concerns every leader within an organization is framed with around these three things or combination of these things, right? Because whenever you decide to make change, and again, change is sometimes forced upon organizations most of the time nowadays, there's risk, right? And they have to mitigate the risk. And both of those things together are hand in hand. But as soon as you have change, you're now forcing people to look at things differently and learn new things, right? And it affects the performance of the organization. So it's always those three elements that those senior leaders, and that's just senior leaders, but all leaders with an organization, depending on the level of granularity, look at. And so if I were to tell anybody today in learning and development, speak to them on those three levels, because now you're speaking their language.
I know we have just scratched the surface of your new book, but we want to let people know where they can learn more, where they can pick up a copy to dive even deeper into this topic.
Well, let me say, first of all, I have no hidden agenda here. And I don't want to undermine anybody else. I follow basically the Kirkpatrick methodology within the book. So Kirkpatrick's level 1 to 4. I actually work it backwards. And so I don't have any vested interest in the methodology. But at the end of the day, you don't even have to buy my book because everything I'm saying is found in every text that any business person has studied. So all of my training is in every textbook in managerial accounting, finance, and all that stuff I'm talking about is not Ajay saying it. It's not my methodology. This is part of the financial standards, the accounting standards, the strategic decision-making process. And so you don't have to buy this book. I do encourage you to do so, but you don't have to buy it. You can get, if you took a business class somewhere, go pull out a managerial accounting textbook. That will speak to everything you need to know that I just said. And I'm saying that only because I'm afraid people buy into certain methodologies as shortcuts. And there are certain methodologies out there in training development that are very dangerous and should not be applied because they hold no credibility and they're not even valid in the real world. So that's one thing I would say to people that don't believe me. Find what I say and verify what I say. Second, where you can find a book, of course, I'm published through Kogan Page. And I think I've offered your audience a discount code. I think hopefully you'll share in the podcast.
Put that in the show notes.
Yeah. That they can get for 20% discount at koganpage.com. And I think they still have free shipping in it too. So if they want to take advantage of that, I encourage them to do so. And it's not that thick. So it's a good book. It's not expensive to buy, plus a 20% discount. I think you'll get a lot out of it. But again, don't stop there. like I said, the information is out there. We're learners. We tell people to learn. We should be learning ourselves as well. So become more business literate when you're out there talking to your colleagues.
Well, it all makes sense. And even though you don't necessarily want to sell the book, we will help you sell the book. We'll put the link to the book as well as some of your recent articles in the show notes of the podcast for sure.
And by the way, there's tons of articles out there they can get through trainingindustry.com. I know we all enjoy that. We go to the Training Industry Conference together.
Yeah, that's where we met.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great conference. And they have a great publication. I have a feature article out there on learning metrics. And I have over 25 years, I've written thousands of articles. So I hope people just Google my name and they'll find some free stuff out there.
Thank you very much for joining us today. It was great to see you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Mason, for having me. I appreciate being here.
Great to see you, Ajay.
Mason, Ajay really had some good reminders about the importance of learning metrics.
Yeah, absolutely, Susan. The message from Ajay and his new book on learning metrics are a great reminder for us all to stay focused on the KPIs of the organization. And ultimately, that's where our learning efforts need to flow back up to. So at DaVinci, we always advise our clients about the best ways to handle their learning data through SCORM conformance, proper integration into their learning management system, and reporting on that data. And ultimately, that data has to flow back to organizational metrics. So a great reminder.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mason. And special thanks to our guest, Ajay Pangarkar, for joining us today. If you have an idea for a topic or a guest, please reach out to us at poweredbylearning@davinci.com. And don't forget that you can subscribe to Powered by Learning wherever you listen to your podcasts.